Up next on Book TV's Afterwards, radio talk show host Mark Levin argues against expansion of the federal government in his book Rediscovering Americanism. He offers his thoughts on what the country must do to reverse course and return to what the founders intended. Mr. Levin is interviewed by former South Carolina Senator Jim DeMint.
Mark, congratulations on another bestseller.
Thank you.
It's good to be on the set with you. Usually I'm on the phone in some dark corner of the Capitol talking to you, but Rediscovering Americanism and the Tyranny of Progressivism. You know, I actually found it a deeper, more scholarly, even though I've read some of your other books, a lot of history, a lot of research, and an excellent contrast between the principles and values that are essentially American and the ideas and the motives of progressives. And so one of the things that hit me in the first chapter was that what we call conservatism is really Americanism. We'd probably been a lot better off if we'd named this whole idea, because what we're trying to conserve are those values, principles, and ideas that made this country so unique and free and prosperous. I think that's the best place to start. What is Americanism to you?
It's a great point, and that's exactly my point in the book, too. We have a superficial discussion about Americanism and American principles. And I said, all right, let's figure out what Americanism is. You know, people talk about populism, nationalism, conservatism, thisism, that-ism. And so I, as you know, I research, and I dug into this, and the founders told me where to go. Yeah. They told me to look at Aristotle, and Cicero, and Sidney, and Locke, and Montesquieu, and even some of their contemporaries, Adam Smith, and Edmund Burke, and so forth. And what does this term Americanism mean? And so the first chapter, as you know, I spend time on that. And what's interesting is, even though they didn't agree in every single nuance, there were fundamental understandings in the founding. Mm-hmm. The Revolutionary War was fought over Americanism. Yeah. So what does Americanism mean? And essentially, we'll get into this, the core issue is what we see in the Declaration of Independence. When people read it, they quickly go over a couple of words that are the most critical words in the Declaration of Independence, like natural law and laws of nature, which, from my experience in school, was never taught to me, never discussed, it's never debated, and yet that was the core of the American founding. And this whole issue of Americanism, it's crucially important to understand it because it's under attack. Mm-hmm. It's being devoured by this other force, this other movement called progressivism. Now, Americanism, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's the most formal consensus position of the founding. There they were, really already at war with Britain, and they wanted to make a public declaration, a declaration to the entire world on what it was they were doing. And so the colonies, the states, send individuals, the Second Continental Convention in Philadelphia. And they debated this, and they discussed it. And so there were several drafts of the Declaration of Independence. But the original draft, of course, we know was Jefferson. And what I get into here is, but there were other declarations. Mm-hmm. The first one before that was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason, which Jefferson borrowed from. And they both borrowed from John Locke. Then you had the Pennsylvania Declaration, written mostly by Benjamin Franklin. You had the Massachusetts Declaration, written by the Adams cousins, Sam Adams and John Adams, all almost identical, all referring to natural law, all referring to unalienable rights, all referring to property rights, even the happiness part of the Declaration. So I get into that, where does all that come from? And I'm hoping when you're done chapter 1, you're excited and inspired and invigorated by the most fascinating founding of any country ever on the face of the earth.
I think we forget just how different Americanism is. And you get it in the second chapter, you provide the contrast of the whole progressive idea under various names, but the ideas, the history, the philosophers, you get into that more in the third chapter. But they say that progressivism, at least those who call themselves progressive, is about equality. It's about governing based on the will of the people. But you point out very clearly that it really is completely the opposite of that. Talk about progressivism.
Whereas Americanism is about the individual, it's about creating a society that nurtures the individual, that protects the circle of liberty around the individual, and yet has a civil society so you can function. Laws that are predictable and stable, and yet don't molest the individual, don't dominate the individual. That's really what we're talking about. Versus progressivism, it's an ideology. It's an ideology, whether it's Marx or Hegel or Rousseau or even others. And that's an ideology that essentially requires the individual to surrender their individualism to the state. And the state promises that if you do that, it will provide for you. It will ensure that you're taken care of in certain ways, and will ensure this egalitarianism, this equality. Equality or egalitarianism of that sort is tyranny, because it destroys the nature of the individual, free will, the consent of the individual, and the state becomes very, very powerful. Now, there was a time when this was all theoretical, in the 1850s, the 1830s, and so forth. But it's not theoretical anymore. These ideas of progressivism, which I really prefer in prior books to call statism, because they self-identify as progressive. There's nothing progressive about it. It's regressive. But that's progressivism, the progressive. And so it's an ideology that is completely counter to Americanism and our founding. And it's that ideology that I also explain in the book, because it's devouring the purposes of the American Revolution. We have a counter-revolution, a non-shooting counter-revolution of intellectuals and government and bureaucrats that are destroying the very basis for the American founding.
What could possibly be the motivation for this? I would think, if I'm not being too cynical, that these progressive philosophers believe that this statism, this central power, is actually going to be better for people. Is that their motive?
Now, that's a very, very interesting question. I would address it this way. There are the masterminds, and then there are the followers.
Right.
The followers, the people who are sucked into this ideology, I think for the most part it's unwitting, or it's just selfish. They think they're going to get something for nothing, or whatever it is. Or, as I point out in a different book, Meritopia, maybe they're just malcontents, and they reject the existing society. They attack it. But for the masterminds, I don't give them much quarter, because at this point, 100 years of this ideology, and this ideology embraced in foreign countries and so forth, has been very bleak, very dark, very detrimental to the human race. And this notion, which is to centralize decision-making in the hands of masterminds, experts, professionals who are not experts nor professionals, people who wish to impose their own personal policy beliefs on the rest of society, which requires some sort of a police state, whether it is a massive bureaucracy that imposes its will through fines and punishments, or whether it is some other form of imposing their will. The fact of the matter is, they're never done. Even the toaster in your house now, the government has to decide if the toaster is acceptable. The paint in your house, the crib in your house, all these things. And contrast that with our philosophy, Americanism. Look around you. You've got so many wonderful things going on as a result of Americanism, as a result of the founding, that the government attacks. You go into a grocery store today. You go into a 7-Eleven today. It's open 24/7. I don't typically, but you can go in there, you can get pretty much anything you want, right? Wine, beer, bread, hot dogs, you can get cookies, get whatever you want. Now, how many societies have 7-Elevens like that? Almost none. You go into a major grocery store today. You can get meats, you can get fish, you can get fat. My point is this. The average person today is better than kings and queens lived 250 years ago. Look at the airline system. You get on a plane, it's air conditioned. We complain about the seating. We don't like the pretzels. Think about it. We go across country, 40,000 feet in the air, or whatever it is, air conditioned, fed, their bathrooms, 4 or 5 hours across the country. Unfathomable. Unfathomable. Government didn't create that. Liberty created that. You go in your home today, you flick on a switch, electricity comes in. That's Americanism. Yeah. You have fresh water, you turn on a faucet, cold water, hot water, that's Americanism. All these things are Americanism. The regulation of these things, the banning of them, the controlling of them, the taxing of them, that's progressivism.
Mm. Well, well, Mark, you point out, and I probably should have that paragraph to read, but I suspect you can almost give it to me verbatim. The results of this centralized planning, this administrative state, have been so abysmal and tragic, not just in the U.S., but throughout history, around the world. We've seen what it does to people. It doesn't lift up the common man. It oppresses the common man. It creates poverty instead of what you were just describing, how basically a free market system that can make some very wealthy actually creates a better situation for all the rest of us. So why can't people see the obvious here? What do you think is keeping Americans from understanding that these original American ideas were so superior to what we're dealing with now?
First of all, if you believe in Americanism, you believe in the power of the individual human being. If you believe in progressivism, you believe in the power of a handful of human beings controlling all the rest. Mm-hmm. And I've always said, if human beings are imperfect, and we are, then why would we want a handful of them controlling the rest of us?
That's right.
If they make bad decisions, then those bad decisions are pushed throughout society. Mm-hmm. If I make a bad decision, then I've made a bad decision for myself and my family. It's a minimal consequence. Yeah. Look at Obamacare as a side example. We don't even know who really developed Obamacare. We don't even know why they really developed it. Massive government intrusion. We were told, experts and professionals, it is the biggest mess on the face of the earth. They don't even have the wherewithal to fix it, quote unquote, and they have disrupted in a significant way our healthcare system. Now, I point that out because more and more of these centralized decisions are being made, and you ask a great question. Why don't people see this?
Right.
Because the endless promises, if you'll just surrender more of your liberty, right, if you just surrender more of your property, we will create paradise, and people want to believe. Mm. And for some reason, people think governmental decisions are noble and individual decisions are selfish. You know, in the book I talk about many men, but including John Dewey. And John Dewey says, one of the most important of the progressive intellectuals at the time, and he lived to be well into his 90s, had an enormous amount of influence. John Dewey made clear that they had to, and I'll use my words, infiltrate the educational system to push this agenda, to change the mindset of the American people. They said this rugged individualism, this pioneer spirit, all that stuff, that's well and good, but we have a modern, complex society. We can't just be faced, you know, we just can't encourage the individual to be what they want to be. And so we have to manage this. We have to organize this. Mm-hmm. We have to create plans. We can't allow business to go off and do railroads on their own. We can't allow individuals to go off on their own interests. We got to figure out how to advance our society. And of course, they turn to Marx and Hegel and Rousseau and people of that kind who push an ideology of collectivism. And all their ideas, which they impose on the people through the power of centralized government, they wrap in the best interest of the public, the best welfare of the public, mm-hmm. the general will of the public. And interestingly enough, Jim, when push comes to shove, even though they talk about populism and popular sovereignty, it's all about centralized government making decisions, imposing its will on the population. I don't mean to make this too complex, but I also get into the book about the question of liberty. Mm-hmm. What do we mean by liberty? Right. For the progressive, it's called positive liberty. For the rest of us, it's negative liberty. Now, the word should be reversed. Oh, that's positive. They always steal the nomenclature. Oh, it must be good. No, it's not. What we mean by liberty is, look at the Bill of Rights. negative liberty. That is, we have liberty, and the negative is against government encroaching on our liberty.
That's what Obama didn't like about the Constitution. He
Correct.
said it's a negative document because it tells the government what it cannot do, but it does not say what it must do.
Exactly. And positive liberty, as it's come to be known, is the government telling people what they can do. Right. So when they say, we're going to give you free health care, we're going to give you free college, that's called positive liberty. And of course we know it's not free, and of course we know it will be an economic disaster, and so forth and so on. Negative liberty is basically, stop interfering with my life, stop trying to dominate me, stop trying to legally molest me, and we understand we're not anarchists. We understand there needs to be a basic law and basic rules, but beyond that, pretty much, leave us alone.
In the book, you talk about the confusion between democracy and republicanism, the idea of a republic. I don't think people are very clear on that. Explain why that's important when looking at Americanism and progressivism.
Great point. This is crucially important. The founders of this country feared two things. Centralization. They just fought a monarchy for 8.5 years. And they knew about central government. They were enormously well read. Aristotle and Cicero and all the rest of them. They saw what happened in Rome. They saw what happened in Greece. They saw what happened in Britain to America. So they were very concerned about centralized government. So you look at the Constitution, separation of powers, and the Senate's to be chosen by the state legislatures, and the Electoral College, and the only directly elected body is the House of Representatives, and the courts are distinct in that you have lifetime appointments. This was what they were debating. Why? They didn't want centralized power. What else didn't they want? Mobocracy. Pure democracy. Remember, the Declaration talks about unalienable rights. Unalienable rights are not up for a vote. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter what your neighbor thinks about your unalienable right. It doesn't matter if we have a plebiscite or a referendum on your unalienable right. These are God-given, eternal truths, universal truths, or as Aristotle called them, universal law versus particular law, statutes and so forth. And they were concerned about that too. In particular, John Adams talks about private property rights. And he says, let's take a country of 10 million people. Let's say 2 million people own property. Well, if it's subject to a vote, those 2 million people are going to lose their property, right, and you're going to have nothing but the law of the jungle. And so they rejected populism. They rejected it. They didn't reject the consent of the governed. They wanted republicanism. They also rejected nationalism in the sense of a centralized government. And what I explain in the book is some people confuse nationalism with Americanism. Mm-hmm. It's Americanism that we're trying to defend. It's our unique founding, our unique principles that we're trying to defend. So I think that's a very, very good point.
You and I talked a little bit about this before the show, just the concern that a lot of folks don't understand what you're talking about, what you have in the book. And I know you wrote the book to promote that understanding, but my observation of progressives that I know in the Congress, and some of them are, as you said, some of them are kind of the masters, and some of them have been co-opted by this idea as the best way to help people is to plan for them. But it seems that the natural default position of humankind is this idea of progressivism, of that the powerful control the powerless. And even though everyone, I believe, has a yearning in their heart for freedom, the tendency is for folks to feel like they need to be controlled, or either they need to be the ones controlling. Americanism, as you explain it, to me, is more of a supernatural. It's not a natural default position. When you speak of things such as the Creator and natural law and virtue and understanding human nature and why government needs to be set up to restrain it, we're talking about something that requires a lot of education and understanding. It requires people to constantly push for those ideas, to persevere, to be vigilant. I think our founders understood that when they said you've got a republic. I think Benjamin Franklin said that. You've got a republic if you can keep it. And they kept talking about vigilance of the people. I think the country naturally, and I guess people naturally go towards this centralized power, and we have to constantly resist it. What are your ideas on that? I know you talk about it throughout the book, that this is why you wrote it, is so we can resist it. But how can we deal with such a natural part of human nature which tends to go towards progressive thought?
Here's the thing. When the country was founded, it was understood why we fought a revolution. Mm-hmm. The revolution began in Boston. They weren't fighting over health care. They weren't fighting over food stamps. They weren't fighting over egalitarianism. They're fighting over liberty. And it was understood when they met in Philadelphia more than once. The Second Continental Congress for the Declaration of Independence, then later, after the Articles of Confederation failed, the Constitutional Convention, also in Philadelphia. There was a common understanding among those men, of natural law and what all that meant. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm trying to do with this book is put us in that place, see what they were thinking and arguing, who they were relying on. They didn't invent these ideas. Why they're so crucially important. And today it's not only the default position, progressivism, it's the only position that's discussed. Mm-hmm. You will not find these issues discussed in any Republican caucus in the House or the Senate. Right. You will not find these issues discussed on most of talk radio, on most of cable TV. What has happened in the last 110, 120 years is the progressive movement has succeeded. It has succeeded in resonating throughout society. It has succeeded through the culture, through the media, through the Republican Party, mm-hmm. clearly through the Democrat Party. Now, there are Democrats who understand this. Bernie Sanders knows exactly what's going on. Knows exactly what's going on. Now, he may, in a very inarticulate way, put his views out there, but if I were to talk to him today about Hegel and Marx and Rousseau, he'd know exactly what I'm talking about. If I were to talk to, so I won't embarrass you, to one of the Republican leaders in the Senate mm-hmm. about Locke and Montesquieu and Cicero and Aristotle, they'd have no idea what I'm talking about.
You're right.
So the point is, these men of the left and women of the left, they stand on the shoulders of the progressive intellectuals of 100 years ago, who stand on the shoulders of the philosopher kings who preceded them 100 years before. There are a handful of us, or a certain percentage of us, who know this and who are trying to confront this. And usually we're attacked and put down within the Republican Party or within their own surrogates, because we see and we understand what's going on. And the question that some of us raise, are we too far gone that we can't move back? Or what do we need to do to try and pull back? Because this is only going to get worse. That is, the coercion and the bullying and the centralization. Where does it end? Jim, I often say, will the statists, the progressives, will they give us their blueprint and tell us when they're done? In other words, when will you be done with health care? When will you be done with immigration? When will you be done with taxes? And give us something that we can debate, but they're never done. So they're never done tormenting the individual, and they're never done controlling the individual, and the trajectory is toward increased autocracy. And so if we lose out one day, it'll be a very, very sad thing. What do? We do everything we can through public means, whether it's books, if people even read them anymore, whether it's radio, whether it's TV. You've done an excellent job where you're fighting within, you're trying to effect the nature of the Republican Party and the nature of the debate when it comes to the Constitution and Article 5. These are things that 10 years ago nobody would have even thought of doing. So these are the things we have to do.
The progressives in Congress, and I've worked with them. I mean, some are well-intended, but I think some want to be, as it was said, they want to be benevolent masters, but they intend to be masters here. Mm-hmm. They know what they want on health care, for instance. I mean, it doesn't matter if Obamacare fails. They want centralized government-run health care, and I think a lot of them believe that's what's going to be best for people. The problem we have on the other side, and I've sat with Republicans in the House and the Senate on this, is they don't necessarily understand how Americanism could really work in health care. The idea that a free market healthcare system could actually create better quality at a lower cost, at better access, because they don't know exactly how that system works, and it can't be put in a government program. And so it's like we're fighting something with nothing a lot of times, and so a lot of Republicans tend to go centralized light. You talk about it a lot on your show. I don't think a lot of us understand the counterintuitive idea of Adam Smith, that just millions of people pursuing their own interest, doing their own thing, actually create a more positive society, a better organized society, than a few people planning for everybody. To me, that's counterintuitive. I don't know how you see that from, you talk to a lot of people on your show, you talk to millions of people. How do we deal with this counterintuitive argument when a lot of people who are making laws supposedly on our side don't seem to understand how Americanism works?
First, we talk about it, because we never talk about it. Let's talk about what you just mentioned. I would say to the American people, which handful of politicians do you think are so smart that they can understand and run the healthcare system from soup to nuts? Almost none of them are doctors. Almost none of them have ever worked at hospitals. Where do they get their genius from? Where do they get their professionalism from? Where do they get their expertise from? Nowhere.
Yeah.
They're advancing an ideology, a theory, and they're trying to impose it on us. That's what's going on. The public's not happy with what's going on in healthcare. We're on the winning side, but we never explain to people what's going on. The public resists politicians and big government. But what the progressive does is make promises. You're going to get this for free, and we're going to make sure there aren't profiteers and this sort of thing going. The point you make about the harmony of interests, as Adam Smith called it, the invisible hand, which is mocked now. Yeah. What he meant and why it's so crucial is people are making, in any given day, 320 billion people are making 1 trillion decisions. It's not possible for a government department or agency to know better about those 1 trillion decisions. It's impossible for people, even the most studious and brilliant people, even the most earnest people, to know what to do. They can't possibly acquire the knowledge that 320 million people have in exercising their own lives and pursuing their own interests. So what happens is rather than trying to figure all that out, instead they take their personal policy preferences and impose it on a free people. On a free people. And it becomes difficult to explain that to people because we've been indoctrinated from elementary school through. I'll give you an example. The Industrial Revolution was the greatest economic event in human history. It created the mass middle class that we have. It created so many of the products and services that we have. It improved the quality of life. And yet, when you watch documentaries on PBS and other places, what do they show you? The steel mills where there's strikes and people are being shot. They'll show you the pollution from Rockefeller and crude oil. They'll show you all these things that take place. What they won't show you is that the vast majority of the American people had their lifestyles increased, got electricity, could afford automobiles, changed the entire face of the United States. And even today, we benefit from what was the Industrial Revolution. Some will say, what about these robber barons? Well, they had to create the capital necessary in order to build a railroad system, an assembly line system, and so forth and so on. And I find it ironic that these professors and other so-called scholars of the left are very troubled by that. But they're not troubled by governmental monopoly. So in other words, businesses out there, and I'm not pressing monopolies, I'm just making a point, businesses out there that become so incredibly successful providing people with goods and services, they need to be broken up. Government, which is centralized, doesn't provide excellent goods and services. The more centralized it is, the more inhumane it is. These same people who oppose in the private sector the centralization of power, fight for it in the governmental sector. And the difference between centralized power in government and the private sector is government makes laws. Government can put people in prison. Private sector does none of that.
There are some positive things developing, perhaps outside of politics, but as we've seen, the technology has really decentralized communication and media in a lot of ways. Now we have so many ways to communicate with people. So in a lot of ways, this has gone back to the individual. Everyone has their cell phone. They can access any information in the whole world. And we see that affecting a lot of, even the media. That was a few major networks now, because of the internet, has been decentralized. Do you think that gives some promise that individuals who understand the freedom they have to make their own decisions because of technology or choosing their own media source, do you think that's going to work its way over into politics and with the yearning to bring government back closer to home and make it more personal?
I wish it would, but how many efforts have been made now to control the internet?
Yeah,
it's constant.
Yeah,
and you hear the attacks on social media and this truly diverse and dispersed now media platforms. Mm-hmm. I don't like a lot that's said about me on social media. What are we supposed to do? Destroy social media?
Right.
So the point is, I think there's going to be this effort by government to continue to control, give phony names like neutrality, when in fact government's trying to control the internet and things of that sort. I think that's all good. These competitive forces, I'm all for them. But I keep going back to something you said earlier. How do we reach the vast majority of the American people to inspire them to defend their own liberty?
Right.
And this is the great question. This is the great question. And one of the things I discuss in the book is this. Liberty requires virtue. Liberty without virtue is not liberty. Mm-hmm. It can be whatever it is. It can be violence. It can be you're free to do things that are not appropriate. Virtue, a moral order, natural law. John Adams talked about it. Jefferson talked about it. As a matter of fact, I have a letter in the book where Jefferson, two old men at this point, Jefferson writes Adams, and they're talking about liberty. And Jefferson writes this unbelievable letter talking about Greece and Rome. And he focuses in on Rome. And he says, John, take a look at Rome. Take a look at Rome. Cicero, Brutus, and Cato, the great Republicans. Even if they, near the end of Rome, could control the government, it would have been too late. Why? Because he said the people lost their virtue. There is nothing, Jefferson said, that government can create. There's no governmental system that can be created to save a people who don't want to be saved. Mm-hmm. It's similar to something Franklin said, where Franklin basically said, we're trying to create a constitutional system that will allow people to pursue their happiness, to pursue their interests, and will limit government, the centralized government. But if the people are not resolute, there's nothing we can do about it. So we have to be resolute. We have to maintain our virtue, or all the rest of it collapses. So to answer your question, this is something I struggle with all the time, and I think you do and a lot of people do, which is, have we reached a point where we can't get back? Mm-hmm. Are we now overwhelmed in the culture, in politics, in the media, with this progressivism notion of centralized government, of phony egalitarianism, of the smothering of individualism? Has it become so entrenched in our institutions that there's no way to rip it out? And I say this, we have to do everything we can to confront it, to debate it, to explain to our fellow citizens what's taking place. We simply have no choice.
I don't think we have the right to give up. When people tell me, Jim, it's gone too far. Believe me, I've been concerned. I ran for Congress because I was concerned dependency on government would eventually take that virtue away, that desire for liberty, and the objectivity of a voter. I was definitely concerned about that, but we can never give up. And when I see that it seems like it's insurmountable, this is what I tell crowds. If you want to give up, just think about the men sitting at the table signing the Declaration of Independence. What chance did they have to win? You know, it slim to none by any objective standards. But liberty, virtue, the things you talk about, were so important to them because they had a clearer contrast of what the opposite of that was. I think we've forgotten that because we haven't had to live with the type of oppression that will be upon us suddenly if our liberty is taken away. So we can't give up, and I'm going to continue to fight to do more to support conservatives on the inside, but there's a lot more we can do, and you have talked about it. I'm working on something with Tom Coburn. It fits in with what I hear the states talking about now. I just went to a convention in Denver of a lot of state legislators, and the whole discussion was about federalism. More than I'd ever heard before, states were realizing that they needed to take back control. Now, this is not the complete solution, but it is an element of virtue when people begin to wake up. And states have sued the federal government against for Obamacare, amnesty, almost unprecedented pushback at the state level. And you've been talking about for several years, and I really didn't pay much attention to this idea of Article 5 until you and Tom Coburn came to visit me at my last place of employment and made a compelling case that the founders anticipated where we are today and gave us a mechanism to restrain the federal government. And we call it the Article 5 Convention of States, the Convention to Propose Amendments. Would you talk a little bit about Article 5 and maybe what your transition has been from maybe thinking about it one way and how you think about it today?
Yeah. Couple of things. Something interesting going on in the states. Federalism. Federalism, as you know, is the 10th Amendment. It is the states have plenary sovereignty under our Constitution, except for those areas where the Constitution carves out federal power. The state conventions would never ratify the Constitution where federal departments and agencies dictate to the states, where federal judges dictate to the states. And so we've had, in essence, a complete rewrite of the Constitution without a constitutional convention, without amendments. And it happens every day, as you and I have discussed. When Congress meets, apparently it's a constitutional convention.
Sure is.
When the Supreme Court meets, apparently that's a constitutional convention. When the president issues an executive order, or the bureaucracy pushes out 3,800 regulations, that's a constitutional convention. But other things going on in the states before I get to Article 5, just to lay the foundation, because there's some confusion. We have Republican governors who claim to support federalism and don't want the government getting in the way, who lobbied recently the Republican Senate not to change Obamacare on Medicaid.
Right.
Because it was found money, 100% on the dollar, to help them balance their budgets.
Right.
That's a disgrace. They claim to support federalism. They want the money from the federal taxpayer on the one hand, and then they claim they support federalism. Well, they don't. That's a big problem. Then we have blue states where some of their cities claim that they're sanctuary cities, and they claim federalism. But as you know, immigration is a plenary federal role. Exactly. It's in the Constitution. So they claim basically nullification of the federal role because they are ends justify the means types. So we've got all that confusion going. Article 5, Convention of States. I say to my conservative friends, I thought you support the Constitution. You support the Constitution, accept that part of it? Mm-hmm. And why don't you accept that part of it? That's the fire alarm. Mm-hmm. Article 5 is simply the two methods to amend the Constitution. And it's spelled out there. And there was one method originally when they were debating it in Philadelphia, as we know from Madison's notes. and that would allow 2/3 of both houses of Congress to propose an amendment to the state legislatures, and then you would need 3/4, or today 38 state legislatures, to ratify. There's another part. George Mason, 2 days before the end of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, stood up and said, well, this can't be. What if we have an oppressive Congress? What if we have an out-of-control federal government? The Congress isn't going to propose anything to fix it. They're the problem.
Yeah.
The state legislature should have a role in this. So there's a second part in Article 5 of the amendment process that simply allows the states to do what the states have always done. Meet, discuss, debate, and come up with ideas. All this does is it empowers the state legislatures to have a convention, not a constitutional convention, a convention of the states, to discuss and propose amendments to the Constitution just as if Congress was. And you have to go through the same ratification process. It takes 38 states to ratify. And we have these fearmongers, pseudo-conservatives among others, who are saying you'll have a runaway convention. How do you have a runaway convention when 38 state legislatures have to approve whatever comes out of that convention? It's not possible. So it takes 13 states to stop whatever comes out of that convention. And not only that, I thought we supported federalism. I thought we had faith in the state legislatures. So if we don't have faith in the state legislatures, then we don't have faith in any government anymore. So you're not a federalist if you oppose Article 5 Convention of States. You don't support the 10th Amendment if you oppose this article. All this does is it allows the states to meet on certain specific subjects that they know in advance. The state legislatures send their delegates. The state legislatures decide how many delegates are going to be sent. They've already been meeting and talking about this. And some of the amendments that have been discussed and that I proposed in my own book, the Liberty Amendments, is to limit the size and growth of the government, to limit their taxing and debt authority, to term limit members of Congress, to term limit Supreme Court justices, to have a debate on these issues. Because if we actually believe that there's going to be some kind of reform coming out of Washington that has created this design, that's built walls around itself to prevent the public from having actual, real, effective input, it's not going to happen.
Well, I have a lot of empathy for the critics of Article 5 because I was one myself because I really had not studied it. And I came to Washington believing we could solve the problem here. I came in '99 in the House. Tom Coburn was there and no two people fought harder to restrain spending, balance the budget. And we actually, back in the late 90s, talked about balancing the budget and pretended we balanced it one year with by borrowing from Social Security and other things. But now we've gotten further away from the idea. And if a president, like President Trump, sends a budget over, and it doesn't really balance, in the out years they say it might if the economy grows, but if you talk about balancing the budget in 10 years, even Republican leadership will say you're extreme now. And I took the time after you came to make a presentation, you and Tom, to look at Article 5. It's actually pretty short and simple. Like you said, it gives the country two ways to amend the Constitution, and they are treated with equal value. One is not a radical. In fact, when people say we could have a runaway convention, first thing I say is, hey, we already have a runaway Congress, a runaway bureaucrats, runaway judges and courts. The chances of 38 states taking away their own rights and the rights of their people are just slim to none. It's not going to happen. And the way this is set up, the version Tom Coburn and I that you've advocated, the Article 5 Convention of the States, with three subject matter areas. Restrain the government fiscally, things like balancing the budget, but have to do it with general accounting principles and limiting taxes. But balancing the budget alone is not going to do any good if the federal government's still trying to run all areas of our lives. So we have to restrain the federal government jurisdiction over the states, things like unfunded mandates or managing our schools or health care, the things they don't need to do. And I continue to be a believer in term limits, and whether it's term limits of bureaucrats or judges or congressmen and senators, I think it's an act of mercy to make sure no congressman stays here more than 12 years. So 12 states have already done this, and I've been meeting with states the last few months. I've been encouraged that more states realize that we frankly don't have much to lose. And if you ask a person who's opposed, and you just say, okay, if you think this is not a good idea, what is your solution? Do you think Congress is going to balance the budget? And I've come to the conclusion, Mark, I think as you have, that there are only two ways that are going to stop the government from spending. One is a complete economic collapse, and the other is if the states do what the founders anticipated for such a time as this, is to call a convention to propose amendments that could not be run away. And so I've come around to your point of view and been speaking about it everywhere I had a chance. I'm optimistic that this is something, a lot of things you talk about Americanism, if we continue to pursue this Article 5, it's going to educate Americans of what damage the administrative state has done and what our founders envisioned as far as a solution to that problem. You've been talking about it for longer than I have. How do you see the progress or the hope on that front?
We have 12 states, as you said, who are already in, with almost no publicity.
Right.
It's been very quietly done. But there are millions of grassroots advocates who are pressing it. I can't think of a more American approach to something that's going on. It's not violence. It's not extra-constitutional. It's within the four corners of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. We're trying to use the Constitution to save the Constitution. Yeah. And there's nothing more, I think, positive than encouraging the state legislatures. Here's the thing. I spoke in front of hundreds of state representatives at states who are skeptical. Mm-hmm. And I looked at them and I said, you have a duty under the federal Constitution to help your country. Yeah. You have more power than Congress under the federal Constitution if you step up and help your country. This centralization of government, we live in a post-constitutional period for the most part. And much of what the government does is extra-constitutional. Mm-hmm. This is exactly what the Constitution calls for. So we have these conservatives who run think tanks, who write books, who give speeches about federalism, about the 10th Amendment, about separation of powers, against centralization, against what Congress is doing, and then you say, okay, let's go to Article 5 convention and say, no, we can't do that because we'll have a runaway convention, which is an impossibility. I can't even imagine a way in which we would have a runaway convention since 38 state legislatures have to ratify. Now, I have thrown in a number of proposals, others have thrown in a number of proposals, and that's good. Yeah. And these things need to be debated. But people need to understand that the Constitution does provide a way for reining in the central government, reigning in the bureaucracy, reigning in the courts. And this is why the progressives who write the editorials, who run the newspapers, who do the TV shows, and I include a lot of Republicans among them, sure, they reject this because it takes power away from them and actually puts it through the Republican system.
I think the time has come, Mark. It's almost irresponsible now, I believe, for Americans, for politicians at the state level to believe that the status quo is going to work for the country. The good news is I think you've got 90% of Americans virtually have lost confidence in Congress. But they need to know some of the things that you're talking about here. And I don't see this so much as a political process. There is a connection to what you're talking about here of Americanism, the decentralization of power, moving decision-making back to the people. Like you say in here, it's not necessarily what is decided, but who decides how you live. And it gets back to the negative and positive liberty argument, because what we're talking about with the Convention of the States, I guess you would put under the negative liberty category in the sense that it's telling the federal government clearly what it cannot do. It cannot increase the debt or raise taxes. It cannot expand its authority in the states. And so, again, the idea that we're going to have a runaway convention that actually takes away our rights is not within the subject matter of the call. And so, frankly, at this point, I feel a whole lot more secure in this process, and I feel like it needs to happen relatively quickly.
The bottom line for me is this. We need to make the case for Americanism. You know, the Constitution is the governing manifestation of the Declaration. Either people believe in their own unalienable rights, either people believe they were born with these unalienable rights, either people believe in these eternal truths, wherever they come from. It doesn't matter. Universal law. In other words, either you believe that as a human being, apart from government, apart from the bureaucracy, apart from TV, apart from Hollywood, has certain unalienable rights that come from a power more than man, him, or her, man himself, or a collection of men, or they don't. Mm-hmm. Americanism is about, yes, we do. Let me give you an example. Right from wrong, good from evil, the golden rule, the Ten Commandments, the eternal truths that are the Ten Commandments. You can believe them in Topeka, Kansas. Somehow you know that's right. Or Paris, France.
Right.
Now, how do you know? How is it that a person in Paris, a reasonable person in Paris, France, and a reasonable person in Topeka, Kansas know the same thing? How do they know right from wrong? How do they know the golden rule? Forget about the title of the golden rule. Forget about the title of the Ten Commandments. You're not supposed to kill people. You're not supposed to, commit adultery. How do people know that's right and that's wrong? Not because somebody passes a law.
It's written on their hearts.
It's written on their hearts. And Aristotle calls this universal law as opposed to particular law. Cicero talked about it too, and he lost his life. He was killed as a result of it. Many of these men, Sidney, who most people never heard of before, who was hugely influential on the founders, he was killed. Locke feared for his life. All these men who wrote about all these things, facing one form of tyranny or another. And that's the people who the founders relied on. And that's the stuff that's not taught in our schools anymore.
How do we deal, because the things that you're talking about that are essentially American, that are foundational, when you talk about a moral order, natural law, virtue, right and wrong, the golden rule, all of this has kind of been bundled into this religious idea and separated from the operation of government. Which is, we know that's not what it's intended, but that's basically how we've lost virtue, is we're no longer allowed to talk about that in the context of the public sector.
I make the point, I actually made it first in Liberty and Tyranny. The framers of the Constitution were religious men. I don't mean zealots in any way or that sort of thing. They were all religious men. I went and looked at all their backgrounds. They talk about, well, Jefferson was a deist, but he was still religious.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any atheists, but it doesn't matter. Yeah. It's irrelevant. The Constitution doesn't mention any specific religion. Right. The Constitution doesn't even mention God. The reason why we're such a tolerant society, the reason why you look in the First Amendment about not establishing a religion, like they do in the Middle East and other places of the world, is because the men who met in Philadelphia believed in the Judeo-Christian set of values. And they did not want to create a theocracy, and they did not want to impose their views on people. So they created a very tolerant society. Now, what I say to people is, you don't have to be religious. You don't have to believe in anything. But you get the benefit from this society regardless, because of what was created. And that's okay. There are people who have said to me, very interesting question, the Declaration, laws of nature and nature's God. Well, what if I'm an atheist? Can I believe in natural law? I said, yes, you can. We can have a debate where it comes from, but yes, you can. You can believe in eternal truths. You can believe in a moral order that exists no matter what. You can believe in universal law. Aristotle did. He talked about it. So, yes, you can, and you should.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, and I don't know if we covered everything in the book that you think is important, but maybe I should leave the last few minutes to you of not only what's important to Americanism, but what we need to do about it as citizens.
You know, I say this from time to time, which is this. If we leave the battle of ideas to the academics and the intellectuals, we're going to lose everything. Because like it or not, the academics and the intellectuals win out. They win out. They control education. They have enormous influence on politicians. They have enormous influence on the culture. It's not the grassroots. The grassroots can have a political impact, but in terms of what kind of society we want to live in, unfortunately, those decisions are often made by debates. So we cannot leave the battle of ideas to the intellectuals and the academics because we know what most of their ideas are. So the point is, learn as much as you can about Americanism. Learn as much as you can about anti-Americanism, progressivism, so you can tell your neighbors and tell your friends, and we can self-educate the nation. Yeah. Because we're not going to get it through college or through media.
Well, despite all the domination of the progressives in the media, Hollywood, politics, academia, you've still got about half of Americans who somehow continue to vote for the side that they think will create more liberty. And that gives me hope that there's still the yearning inside, and if we can inspire people with ideas like you have in the book, Mark, I think America will step up again and demonstrate their virtue. So thank you for writing the book, all the research that went into it. Thank you for what you do every day.
You too, brother. Appreciate it.
All right.